Many 1950s drive-in monster movies haven't stood the test of time, but one that seems to endure is 1958's The Blob, starring Steve McQueen, playing the world's youngest old man. Now, maybe some people hold this one in higher regard in retrospect because of its star, but I think it holds up for other reasons as well. I'll get to some of those in a minute, but first let me say that The Blob is goofy. I mean, really goofy. If you've never seen it before, you might want to put your expectations into check a bit. You get a hint of this during the opening credits with this not at all scary theme song.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob. Beware of the blob, it creeps.
The plot of The Blob has an object fall from space, and when an old man with a cute dog pokes the space thing with a stick, it doesn't go well for him. Seriously though, it's a really cute dog. Anyway, the blob absorbs living tissue and grows in size as it consumes, eventually threatening the entire town.
Dad, it isn't vandalism. Dr. Hallen is dead and he was killed by some sort of a monster.
The Blob is very much a product of an era that does not exist anymore in any way, shape, or form. Like the moment when Steve McQueen and his date get into a weird bit of road rage with another car full of teens, but soon after they all become best friends to help save the town and battle the Blob. Nowadays they would have just shot each other and the Blob would have eaten us all. Also, everyone in this town talks. A lot. In between Blob bits, characters have conversations to fill up time, and when the topic of conversation is resolved, the entire thing will start all over again. Watching it, you're like, wait, you guys just solved that issue, why are you starting over? Move on. I get it, you had to stretch to get a feature-length film, but jeez. When I was a kid, this was in heavy rotation on one of our local syndicated TV stations, and as such, I would watch it all the time. It freaked me out to the point where years later, I would still look behind me in movie theaters to make sure the Blob wasn't pouring out of the little projection windows like it does here in this iconic scene. I think people who haven't seen the Blob in a while might have overestimated in their minds just how much Blob is in the Blob. I know I did. All in all, I'd say there's probably 7 minutes of actual Blob stuff in this. The rest of the time is eaten away by those circular conversations, and a lot of time is spent with this one local cop who has a raging murder boner for all the teenagers in town.
Who's this? Arthur, who? Is every kid in town in on this? Now, I don't know who this is, but let me tell you, you're going to wish you never thought of this. Hello? Hello?
That being said, I'm still incredibly impressed with the special effects. Despite its sporadic screen time, when you do see the Blob, it's a pretty nifty effect and somewhat disturbing in an otherworldly kind of way. The ending leaves the door wide open for a modern-day sequel. No need for another remake, just go back and capitalize on the ending. The sequel is right there, it's ready, it's been set up perfectly, as the Blob is moved to the Arctic and then characters theorize that they'll be perfectly safe, as long as the Arctic stays cold. With all the global warming talk of the last 20 years, how has Hollywood not capitalized on this? In 1972, there was a pseudo-sequel to The Blob called Beware the Blob. I'll talk about that in a video later this week because, hoo boy, do I have some words to say about it, but for now, let's discuss the 1988 remake. This retelling of The Blob was written and directed by Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont. Darabont, of course, went on to do The Shawshank Redemption and The Walking Dead, but these two together are also responsible for A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which is my favorite and, quite frankly, the best film in that series. The Blob remake takes place in a quiet little mountain town, once filled with tourists for ski season. However, crowds have dwindled over the years and the town is dying as a result. Enter The Blob, which isn't going to help the tourism industry. It falls from the sky, and an old man promptly pokes it with a stick. It does not work out well for the old man. The basic plot points are intact from there on. Old man is taken to the hospital, bad things happen, the blob grows bigger and escapes. The main difference here are the effects, obviously, as the blob no longer absorbs people, leaving no trace behind. Now the blob consumes you, but not entirely and not cleanly. It's more acidic, it corrodes you, and that leads to some grotesque discoveries. The 1950s version is definitely a window into an era that no longer exists, but outside of a few hairstyles, this late 80s version is pretty timeless. It's not an 80s movie in terms of its style or anything, as its direction and pacing are fairly modern. Although a scene in which kids are mad at an adult in a movie theater for talking would make no sense to current children. What I mean though is that watching it today doesn't feel like watching an old movie per se, aside from some of the effects, which sadly don't hold up. Now don't get me wrong, the makeup effects themselves are fantastic, but the blob's movements are often done with a smaller object, which is then superimposed into shots, and it's very noticeable. It's very cool and quite noble, but noticeable. Considering Frank Darabont's involvement in this means, of course, that Jeffrey DeMunn is here, as the town sheriff. He's one of the film's more fleshed out characters, but then he dies off screen, which sucks. There's a third act twist in that the blob isn't necessarily from space, and that's kinda dumb in retrospect. The score is a letdown, and there's a wholly unnecessary setup for a sequel in the final scene that I could have done without. But overall, I think this 1988 version is a worthy companion to the original. Watch them both.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob. Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob.
Kevin, don't eat with your face.